The impact of disease on the history of humanity is undeniable. The entire existence of humans has been subject to a variety of terrible diseases, and because it's so ubiquitous throughout history, it's easy to see the impact of plagues and diseases on the masses of people. But what's hard to see is the impact that disease has on individuals throughout history. And this seems like a small oversight. The general masses of people is a better indicator of the impacts of disease on humanity than perhaps the impacts of an individual is. So it seems like a small oversight, and it generally is, but every now and then throughout history there'll be an individual who revolutionizes something that makes huge strides in the field of science or philosophy, things like that, and it's these people that make an exception to that rule. Isaac Newton was one of these people. Isaac Newton was an English mathematician and scientist. He was born in the year 1642, and he made ginormous contributions to the fields of math and physics. Some say that he advanced the field specifically of physics by hundreds of years. His work was unprecedented, and a bit of uncommon knowledge about Isaac Newton is that his work and his life was strongly impacted by the bubonic plague. In the year 1661, Isaac Newton was admitted to study at the University of Cambridge, and he did very poorly as a student. This was primarily because they were still teaching the works of Aristotle and Euclid. These two were obviously great thinkers, but their work was a bit outdated as it was around 2,000 years old at the time. Because of this, Isaac Newton was very bored by the work he was required to do in school, and the works of these thinkers were just so mind-numbingly obvious to him that he had difficulties in applying himself, and it took his professors a great deal of convincing just to get Newton to study the works of these two thinkers. But then something happened in the year 1666 that changed the course of Isaac Newton's life, and that was that the university closed because of a bubonic plague outbreak, and that gave him 2 years to study on his own. And it was in those 2 years that Isaac Newton made numerous breakthroughs in specifically calculus and in his discovery of the laws of motion. In one of his journals, he noted that it was the plague that forced him from Cambridge that led to him being able to calculate the area under a hyperbola, which was something that had been done before, but it was a very difficult and fiendishly hard task to do with the methods that existed before calculus. But with Isaac Newton's method, it became trivial to do. It's crazy to think that it was the same Black Death that indiscriminately killed a third of the European population in the late Middle Ages. It was that same disease that caused Newton to be able to make all his scientific discoveries in that 2 years that he left Cambridge. I believe that Newton would not have been nearly as scientifically productive as he was without that 2 critical years that he had to work on his own. I believe this because Newton's life is divisible into 3 clear stages. The first being his early childhood through his Cambridge education, and then the second being the most important. It was the time when he made all his scientific breakthroughs that lasted from the time he left Cambridge for about 20 years. But what a lot of people don't know is that Newton's third stage of his life was all devoted to being a highly paid government official. He, for the last 40 years of his life almost, abandoned science and mathematics. So it's not hard to think that without those 2 critical years, that he may not have been able to accomplish as much as he did in the fields of science and math, or that the scope of it would have been much more limited. because it's very likely that he would have went into a different line of work, such as a governmental position, a lot sooner. Bearing in mind that Newton, in his later life, did abandon the fields of science and mathematics, I'd like to present a little bit of a counterfactual history here. And that's that had Newton not had those 2 years to study math and science, the possibility that he didn't do much work in those fields is certainly there, and I think without that 2 years, the field of mathematics in the British Empire would have been accelerated without Newton, and globally the progress made in physics would be astonishingly slower without Newton. That's kind of surprising. Why would math develop faster in England without Newton? That's because Isaac Newton wasn't the only one working on calculus. A brilliant mathematician named Leibniz was also working on it, and he developed a notation that was far more useful in proving other sorts of mathematical phenomena than Newton's notation was. In fact, a lot of mathematical historians believe that Newton's notation set back English mathematics as much as 50 to 100 years after he stopped developing his form of calculus. But definitely without Isaac Newton's contributions to physics, that field would have been crippled. No one else on the European continent was working as hard on physics as Newton was, and without his contributions, the field of physics wouldn't be what it is today. Regardless of the counterfactual hypothesis that I presented, holding water or not, one thing's for certain, and that's that the plague greatly impacted the life of Isaac Newton, and the work of Isaac Newton. Because of that, I can say confidently that, like many other things, human disease has greatly impacted the fields of mathematics and science.